The Rural Development Ministry has sent a report to the Prime Minister suggesting doing away with the consent clause for public-private projects, which currently need consent of 70% landowners. Also reducing the consent requirement for private projects from 80% to 50%. Doing away with the mandatory social impact assessment for small projects and limiting it only to big projects. Reviewing the definition of affected family, as the current one is open to misuse. It also suggests doing away with the clause that says corporates must return unutilized land. Sources in the Rural Development Ministry say that these are suggestions taken forward after last month's meeting with state revenue ministers, including those from Congress states. The ministry officials also insist there is no plan just yet to make changes to the law, but activists are accusing the government of trying to water down the legislation.
I think it's sending very strong negative signals down to all of us that this government is only going to work for the rich and certainly not for the poor.
It's a good step that government is mulling to make some changes in the land acquisition bill. There has to be a balanced approach. We would want that no farmer should suffer.
The government says farmers' interests will be protected.
सरकार करके हमने अभी तक कोई अपना मानस नहीं बनाया, पर अलग-अलग सेक्टर से, अलग-अलग पार्टियों से मेरे ऊपर लगातार प्रेशर है कि इसमें कुछ प्रॉब्लम्स आप इसको कैसा भी करके सॉल्व करिए.
Though the modifications still have a long way to go before they can become law, the government has already started informal consultations with different political parties, even as activists are worried over the direction it could take. In New Delhi with Sunetra Chaudhary, Ketki Angre for NDTV.
Well, the question is whether the dilution then of the land acquisition law is going to end up being anti-farmer, or whether this was absolutely necessary and needed in order to get projects to really begin and get off the ground. Nikhil Dey, activist and co-convener of the NCPRI, also joins us on this tonight. Nikhil Dey, are you very concerned with the changes that have been proposed to the Prime Minister? Do you believe that this is going to hurt the interests of farmers?
Absolutely. These are abominable kinds of changes being proposed. There are several points. Firstly, why was there no consultation held? This was a bill that was being discussed for 6 years, in and out, through and through. And in the standing committee, the BJP chaired the standing committee where Sumitra Mahajan was the chairperson, and they went much further than this bill to say there should be no private acquisition of land at all. We've just been through huge conflicts in Nandigram, or not just in one place, but right across the country. And because of those conflicts, we said we must have a land acquisition bill that looks at the interests of the landowners and the poor. And these kinds of proposals, all of them, actually are extremely damaging. The first proposal that they are saying that the consent will be brought down. Will any of us, will corporate sector give up its own assets without consent, without being willing to give up those particular assets? To remove social impact assessment needs even for small projects. Who is going to look after the interests of small people if we don't have an expert group that is saying are all their needs being met or not? An entire ecosystem is being removed. And to say that people who are either tenant farmers or others who are actually affected by all these projects, their interests are also not going to be considered. All these are completely unacceptable changes. BJP supported this bill in Parliament, and activists actually said that this bill did not go far enough to protect the rights of farmers, land users, and those who live in areas, poor people who live in areas. I think that this is something, there has been conflict in India, and we need to realize we can't squash the interests of the poor and ride and hand over everything to corporates. This is going to cause huge negative reaction, and this is something that the BJP needs to think about, government needs to think about very carefully.
Okay, I'm going to get Gurcharan Das into this, because clearly, activists like Nikhil Dey have a completely diametrically opposite view to what all of you are saying, who, you have believed that the land acquisition law and the way that it was passed was actually just so stringent that it was difficult to get any projects off the ground, for business to be done, and for even, infrastructure to be put in place, even to build hospitals and schools and so on. You've heard Nikhil Dey's concerns. Has this dilution of the law gone to the other extreme then? Mr. Gurcharan Das.
Well, no, actually, we need to balance the interests of farmers and the interests of industry. And so the pendulum was too far in the other direction before. the farmers' protection, it was a statist situation, and the farmer did not have enough protection. Now what's happened is that it's right to protect the interest of the farmer, but what we have created is a monster in this land acquisition bill. And you know, NC Saxena, who was a member of the NAC, he saw this monster growing, and he warned in an important article that he wrote in the Indian Express, saying that this is going to stop all industrialization, because what you have created, when a bill has to go through 100 hands for approval, and when I think what we are objecting to is not the farmer's interest. What we are objecting to is a kind of license raj, is a kind of bureaucratic red tape. I mean, India is known around the world as the worst destination for investment because of red tape. Well, this one has taken it to its absolute ultimate in terms of red tape. So I think let's listen to that warning of NC Saxena and bring some kind of balance. And that's what they're trying to do now. And I think the question that Nikhil Dey is saying about the BJP approved, BJP was one of the worst oppositions we've had. They approved all the bad laws, and they did not push the good laws that were needed. So let's not go by that.
But Vikram Mehta, the reality is Vikram Mehta, and because Vikram Mehta, you know, Nikhil Dey makes a point on principle that, you know, how can you reduce the consent clause, for instance? I mean, would you be willing to give up your assets without your own consent? And on that principle, is it fair to say that that consent clause should be done away with in some cases and then reduced to 50% in others? Is that fair?
No one is suggesting that there be forced expropriation of farmers' land. There is going to be consent. What industry is saying is, let's have an arm's length, transparent sort of procedure by which we can acquire land. But what this law is actually doing is actually forcing the industry, A, to pay a very high price for the land. Secondly, it imposes conditions which are unmanageable and also impractical. And thirdly, it allows a situation to develop where you are not going to be in control of your own industry or your own project. The social impact, for instance, assessment means that another layer is created which will then decide whether that project goes ahead or not. Now, I completely agree with Nikhil Dey's principle that growth, if that's the principle he is advocating, that growth must come with equity. And I think industry recognizes that. As I said earlier, industry cannot grow unless it is also seen to be pushing the interest of the wider societal stakeholder group. So industry is certainly going to look at issues related to rehabilitation, issues related to resettlement, issues related to fairness and arm's length relationships with the farmer. But if we want to grow, we have to industrialize. If we want more airports, if we want to create smart cities, we will need a land acquisition procedure that is streamlined and simple. And this is what this act completely obviates. There is no industry that's going to put up a project. There will be no growth as a result. There will be no jobs, and it will be the farmers ultimately and their children who want to move away from the farmland who will be most affected. So I think Nikhil has to actually take a step back and ask himself the question, whose interest is he really trying to protect? Is he trying to protect the interest of the farmers or the generation that follows those farmers, or is he just taking a principled position?
I'll get Nikhil Dey to answer that shortly. I just do want to come to the issue of political hypocrisy though, because Sanjay Jha, while this is a bill and a law that's Rahul Gandhi actively pushed for, isn't it also true that many Congress ruled states also oppose the land acquisition law in their meeting with the newly elected government? I believe that many of the state ministers also felt that the law was just too stringent and there needed to be the dilution of these clauses. So it is even from within your own party that there has been opposition to this law.
I think what you call as opposition, Nidhi Razdan, is just another alternative viewpoint. I want to answer your question though, assuming that you'll give me time. The first point is, if you read it, everybody is calling it a Land Acquisition Act. It starts by calling itself as a right to a transparent, right to a fair settlement. The terms used are resettlement or rehabilitation. And with due respects to some of my very distinguished panelists, the truth of Singur and Nandigram that I think Mr. Day mentioned, or the several SEZs that have been stored, happened on account of the fact that you had very amorphous laws. And in fact, the purpose of the Land Acquisition Act is to bring about greater transparency, reduce litigation, is more industry friendly. And it's absolute rubbish, and I want to say this on your channel because I'm pretty aware of the double standards that's followed. It's absolute rubbish to say that this is prohibiting industrial development. I'll tell you why. You need to understand this clarification, Nidhi, that end of day, this only applies to cases where the government buys land on behalf of a private party or the government acquires land for whatever public purpose. A private body, as it was doing earlier for decades on end, if it wants to purchase land of its own volition and is able to do so with the consent to whoever they are buying it from, it stands uninterrupted. So this is complete hogwash that the private sector is being inhibited by this act. The fundamental point, since somebody mentioned Mr. N.C. Saxena's report, let me tell you the truth. I can quote to you 10 reports that tell you that land cost that the industry is apparently very upset about contributes only 5% to the capital expenditure of any large-sized project that we can perhaps discuss. Number two, even if you include the cost of rehabilitation and resettlement and paying to farmers, which ought to be the job of any government, of any society, but please let's not buy the corporate sector's lip service on it, and I'm part of it by the way as well, that incremental cost only goes up by 3.5%. So I think all this talk about, the fact that we can't grow, that the costs are very prohibitive is nothing but humbug. But corporates stand for profit, so to expect them to actually be mandated to bring any resettlement of their own volition is asking for the moon.
But then, I asked you the question which you didn't entirely answer on why then, state Congress ministers were, opposed to the land law as it stands today. But Nalin Kohli then explained the BJP's turnaround on this. You supported this law initially, and now you've gone back on it.
Well, we haven't gone back on it, because nothing has happened or nothing has changed. What is happening is that there is a consultative process which took place in the Rural Development Ministry when the minister was meeting state revenue ministers. This point came up. And if in a democracy, if governments and their representatives start discussing a point, you don't shut your ear and say, because Mr. Rahul Gandhi was behind this law or it was his favorite law, we can't discuss it. It's a democracy. So I mean, for God's sake, if we discuss a point, there's nothing so sacrosanct about it. The second point is, why do we believe that it has to be either pro-industry or...
You supported this law in Parliament. How did that change? What changed?
Yes, Nidhi. No, that's what I'm saying. Nothing has changed. It's feedback coming. The law is exactly where the law was when it was passed by Parliament. The law is still operational. Nothing has changed.
Yet.
But if different quarters, including Congress and BJP ruled states, are pointing implementation problems, are we to behave like the last government and put our head in the sand and say the problem doesn't exist? Or do we talk about it and find out what exactly are the problems? And can there be a solution? That's the principle. Second point is that why do we believe it to be anti-poor or anti-industry? Either way, it's not going to work. If it's anti-poor, it can't work. And if it's anti-industry, it's not going to work either. It has to be pro-poor and it also has to be pro-industry. The third point is, in a democracy, political parties don't get their votes from corporate India. Political parties get their votes from India. And the vast majority of voters are not employees of corporate India. So it's not as if political parties work necessarily against the interest. That is the notion of the 50s, 60s,
I do wonder why the BJP didn't think of that before the bill was
also
passed.
Proves.
Well, the BJP should have thought, because these are the fundamental issues that this law is about.
No, I'm sorry.
Nalin, let me just give Nikhil a chance to respond, because Nikhil Day, one second Nalin, Nikhil Day wants to come in on that because he raised this question of the BJP's change in position. Nikhil Day, you want to come in on that, and also the criticism you heard from Vikram Mehta and Gurcharan Das.
It's amazing hypocrisy. Because if the BJP had this position before it went to the vote, it should have said, yeah, we think that this Land Acquisition Act that has been passed is completely anti-poor, and we think that this should your consent should be done away with. Let us remember, Nidhi, for the other criticism, that this is actually not buying land, it's not acquiring land, it's coercively taking land from people who don't want to give it, from people whose livelihood depends on it. And even if you had the very draconian land acquisition law of the British times, that was not working. That's why you had people in revolt in Nandigram and Singur. Those laws were not working. Does the industry want to use guns to try and take over land? Does it think just by passing these laws and saying that what is being asked for consent, so that you will not have coercion.
Okay, I'm
and
going
therefore,
to give Vikram
I
Mehta a chance to
think
quickly
India as a
respond to
whole
that.
needs to think very carefully. And
Okay.
I want to say,
I'm not
yeah,
finished
but I
my
want to
point,
say
and
to
I've been
even
called a
Vikram Mehta
hypocrite,
and
so I need
others
to answer
that
that.
All right, Nalin Kohli, answer that point.
To the
I just have a
places
minute
where
left. I just
people's
want to give
land is
everyone a
taken
chance
over.
to make their point. Nalin Kohli, you have 30 seconds.
No, hold on.
Yeah.
You give anybody a chance. I'm not going to take a hypocrite comment coming on me from anybody. I mean, the same as every leftist in the world can talk about anything they want. They didn't create employment enough for it. That's why people were actually running hungry. So, I mean, that's a different point. It's still not hypocrisy. It was passed and nothing has changed. I can tell you the same thing, like the Right to Information Act is a supremely good act. It doesn't mean that it cannot be misused. There was a right to activist on the front page of Indian Express whose job was going out and using it as a tool to collect money from different people. So the misuse of any law is also to be prevented.
Let's discuss right to
and nothing
information
has changed.
separately.
Till all the stakeholders are on board, nothing will change either.
All right. Till all the stakeholders are on board, nothing will change either. I'm afraid I'm completely out of time on what is actually a very complex and an important subject. I do wish we could revisit this debate once these proposals are actually approved by the Prime Minister, if they are. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us on the program tonight. Do join us again tomorrow. See you then.